All right. Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to see everyone. We have another special guest today, Professor Lee Butler of Phillips Seminary, who comes to us from Chicago, where he was 24 years. He focuses on pastoral care and has a really interesting presentation for us today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Professor Butler. Thank you so much. Let's welcome him.
I'm delighted to be with you this morning to share a bit of my thinking around the times in which we've been living. And so this time together has been identified as caring in the midst of the pandemic. And as a pastoral care person, why not talk about pastoral care in the times in which we're living? And it really is a significant time in our history. When the pandemic came around, one of the things we were talking about across the nation is that we've hit that 100-year cycle. That every 100 years we have these major events. And the previous 100-year moment was what they identified as the Spanish flu, which was another world pandemic. And so a lot of us were following how were we handling the previous pandemic so we'd have a better sense of how to handle this one. That is negotiating the health issues, negotiating human relationships. When you look at the images from that period, folks were masked just like we were, trying to really maintain human contact while also trying to remain safe during a moment where they really could not understand. We were coming out of a war. And that always has its own set of issues and tensions around relationships, around the economy. And so we were looking at the economic issues we were facing here in the pandemic. But what was most interesting for us as we addressed the pandemic of the coronavirus was the number of health challenges, mental health challenges that we were confronting and that we still confront. And so as academic institutions, we have a student population that has been experiencing tremendous stress. And it has resulted in quite a few symptoms related to various mental health challenges. If you've been watching the news, even very recently in North Carolina, one of the universities has experienced like its 7th suicide within this calendar year. This is not just about, oh, we're approaching finals. There are other things that are going on within the culture that the coronavirus has brought about significant mental health challenges, and so many institutions have really increased their mental health services. And from my perspective, as a person committed to the church and recognizing that the church is one of those places that addresses mental and spiritual health, and you really can't separate those out in a significant way, that our mental health is connected to our spiritual health. And so as a church community, we have the responsibility to care for folks who are in deep need, not just around clothing and shelter and food, but also their mental, spiritual. And for lots of folks, historically, this has been the place to come. You go to the pastor for your mental health needs. You get the counseling that you need. You have ministries of the church that are focused on caring for people. And so I want us as a church to continue that tradition of that ministry of caring for people and being attentive to every part of what it means to be human. So this does mean remaining aware of the impact, the continuing impact of the coronavirus pandemic on our mental health. Just to put it out in another way, family life is important for our mental health. That's the place where we sleep. If we're not comfortable there sleeping, we're living in anxiety. If we are not comfortable with being able to meet the needs of the family, we're living with profound stress. And the list goes on. So if we are not attending to family life, relationships of the household, there is a significant breakdown of our capacities to interact with one another in relationship. So, first basic question, what is pastoral care? Pastoral care is sometimes identified as the care of souls. I mean, we know that there are many different types of care that we will experience in our society. When we established this approach to care called pastoral care, it's not just about the pastor of the church caring for the soul. It really is more about our understanding of what it means to be human and alive. That pastoral is saying that we recognize that whatever it is about humanity, whatever it is about human beingness, it is related to God as the divine creator. And so all of our relationships are inspired by the presence of the Spirit. Why? Because God created us, molding us from the clay, and then breathing into us the breath of life that we became living souls. And so every living soul has the Spirit of God within. Which means that every conversation is not just human to human, it is divine and human, human and human, human and divine. And so as I'm speaking to you, I'm not just speaking to an animated body. I'm speaking to the divine spirit, and you are engaging the divine spirit. So this pastoral care is about being attentive to the Spirit of God that indwells each of us. Pastoral care has also been identified as the ministry of sharing responsibility for the well-being of another. And so we are talking about, in every conversation, your good. You're talking about my good. And you are asking about, how's life going? And as we are journeying together through life, how can we be in close relationship to address all the issues of life together? Acknowledging that God is in the midst, who always desires our good. Now, what we do have today is because of this desire to be more attentive to interfaith, interreligious, that there are different ways of engaging the Spirit. Pastoral care has often been converted into this idea of spiritual care. And so lots of hospital systems, rather than talking about chaplaincy as pastoral care, they'll talk about chaplaincy as spiritual care, recognizing that the hospital is going to be filled with people with a range of religious experiences. While I'm aware that there is an appropriateness to saying spiritual care, I come through that generation that is pastoral care. And so I still tend to talk about pastoral care. But more importantly than just the generation, it is because of what I've already shared. That for pastoral to be what is describing the care, it really does for me pull into the moment the divine Spirit in a way that saying spiritual care does not. It does really hearken back to the understanding that we are a part of the Imago Dei, the image of God. I was in another place teaching, and I was really talking about how I ground my theological anthropology, my understanding of humanity in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And someone who knew something about my CV said, "I can tell you went to Princeton." That happened before I ever got to Princeton. So, as you're thinking about the work that you might do as care providers, you'll have to decide if it's going to be identified as spiritual care or pastoral care. To highlight the kind of struggles that I'm identifying that we are experiencing socially, I want us to take a look at Mark, the 5th chapter, and verses 1 through 20. And so this is the story about Jesus engaging the man who had legion, the legion of demons within him. So, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he, being Jesus, stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. And so Jesus is trying to go away on a retreat. He's exhausted. He takes the disciples across the sea to this other country, this place that was not filled with Jews, but filled with Gentiles. It was a Hellenistic community. And so he's pretty sure that once he gets across the sea, he's going to be among folks who don't know him, don't recognize him, and he can be himself at rest. But that's not what we encounter. He passes across the Sea of Galilee to this country, and as soon as he steps out of the boat, he is recognized by a man who lives among the tombs, who has been identified as having an unclean spirit. Now, as we work our way through this text, we have those who will look at this and declare that this was a biblical, ancient description of someone with schizophrenia. That's been suggested. Maybe, but I want to hold this as unclean spirit, as demon, possessed, and this man is living among the tombs with this demon. No one could restrain him, not even with chains. He would break the chains and shackles, and he was known to run howling across the mountains and cutting himself. Consider some of these pieces. Have you ever read about someone who cuts? And so we have this man who is cutting himself. And quite often when there is this description of one who engages in cutting, it's because they're trying to feel that the life that have been living has been without emotion, has been without consideration. And they're trying to have someone recognize their struggles. But this story at this point is still talking about someone who is recognized as being outside of the city, living among the tombs. Who chained him? He's living out there among the tombs. Who is feeding him? He's breaking his shackles. How do they know? They've tried to subdue him, and they've been unable, but it suggests that this was not just a one-time trying to subdue him, but many times trying to subdue him. So if you're looking at this text at this moment, and you're looking at it as there is some communal intervention going on here, I want to suggest that this man living among the tombs was sent there by the community in the same way as we will hospitalize some folk. Because he can't keep living there without food. So he's there with demons, unclean spirits. He recognizes Jesus. And when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What are you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me in the same way as these folks have been tormenting me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, My name is Legion, for we are many. He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there were on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, send us into the swine. Let us enter them. So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Now, when the text opens up, the story opens up, it identifies a man came out of the tombs with an unclean spirit, speaking in the singular. But when Jesus engages in conversation, it moves from being a singular to a plural, identifying that what we thought was just one problem that the man had was really more than one problem. It was a complexity of problems, multiple problems. He doesn't want to be tormented and asks Jesus not to torment him. And peculiar that he asked to not be tormented as Jesus says, come out of the man, unclean spirit. Now, I've already indicated that the people were tormenting the man. Or at least that's what he was experiencing from the people, a kind of torment from them. Now, I've already suggested that the man was sent to the tombs by the community as a mental health facility. But there's a tormenting that's going on. When there is someone quite often in the family that has problems, we'll say rebellious teenagers.
What?
There is often such tension between that child and the parents that they feel like they're always being judged, and it becomes this kind of torment that they are experiencing. Or someone else in the house that the relationship is so bad that all you want to do is send them away. And sometimes the relationship is problematic because a family in its system has a way of trying to make itself feel good and be whole. And what it will do is identify someone in the house as being the real problem. That if I get rid of you, then the house will be happy as a home. You think maybe that's what happened to this man out among the tombs? That he is being tormented because he is bearing the burden of what the community has said is their problem. He takes on the problems of the community so that they can live in peace. And so when he's engaging this conversation with Jesus, he's saying, Jesus, don't you do this to me too. Now, I also want to lift up that Jesus is having conversations with this man who is tormented. Talk therapy, maybe? Definitely pastoral care. That we really must engage in a conversation with another if they are to be made whole. So Jesus asks, "What's your name?" And he declares, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And Bible scholars will say, well, the name probably came from this man who's among the tombs, seeing a Roman legion marching by. And so he then identifies himself as Legion because of what he has observed. But the text is saying something a little more than that. Because Jesus is having conversations with the legion within, and the legion begs to not be sent out of the country. And there's the swine, which lets you know this is not Jewish territory. There's the swine. Send us into the swine and let us enter them. Permission's given. Unclean spirits come out, enter the swine. The herd is 2,000, not just one swine runs, but a whole herd runs because of the number of unclean spirits that came out of this man. And they drowned themselves in the sea. Now those who saw this ran off and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. Now, did they come because they saw this as a great miracle? Probably not. Jesus was affecting their livelihood now. He was affecting their economy. So they're like, oh, wait a minute. You can't mess with our money. You definitely have to go. So the people came out, and when they see Jesus and the man who had the unclean spirit sitting clothed in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, they were afraid. Now, when you see someone who has recovered, or we'll put it back into the medical model, someone who you knew was suffering with schizophrenia and they got their medicine right and they're now sitting and able to engage in conversation, do you become afraid? Again, for me, this is an indication that this man was bearing the sins of the community. Everything that they had projected on him, he had received. And now that he was no longer bearing their sin, they were like, okay, what are we going to do now? Because he's whole. Does that mean our problems are coming back to us if we can't point a finger at him to say that he's the problem? They became afraid. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused, said to him, go home to your friends, Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy God has shown you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. So, Jesus has to leave because he has disturbed the balance that they thought they had. As he's getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed says, "Oh, Jesus, please, take me with you. Don't leave me here with these folk." But Jesus does something interesting. He healed him, but then he instructs him to go back home to the places that caused his problems in the first place. What do you think that is saying about the healing process? That if this man would have left with Jesus, it's wonderful he would have been with Jesus, but he would never have confronted the problems of his past, so that the healing would not have been completed. And so he is sent back home for the healing that he experienced from God to be complete, to bond. And so as you're working with people in this pastoral care mode, it is important to not separate them from their families. What do I mean by that? There are approaches to pastoral care and counseling that says, in our conversation, I'm only concerned about your bliss. And I'm looking at you as this isolated individual as though you are connected to no one. If you are going to be whole, I have to recognize that you have other relationships that have informed who you are, that help sustain who you are. I can't work with you as this isolated individual. And that's one of the lessons we get from this text, that you have to keep folks connected to the significant people in their lives, or at least help them to overcome the issues that they have had with the significant people in their lives. Okay, so at this moment, I'm going to take a breather and allow you to ask questions about what I just walked through before I bring some close to the lesson for today.
You talk about pastoral care and spiritual care. Can it be both?
It always is both. But for me, to talk about spiritual care as the label, it's a reduction
I got you.
of pastoral care as I understand it.
Somebody online. Somebody had lights on. Not true. I think they would have spoken.
Another question. Somebody online have a question. Someone in the room. You're working.
I do.
Hello.
Carol, go ahead.
This whole hybrid class, the group now together,
Yes.
is a really wonderful example of pastoral care. And most of us who we met each other online on Zoom when none of us could go to the churches or anywhere. And this group was formed. So by getting to know one another online through Zoom and by you guys persistently working with the technology to find a way that we got together this time every week, it's been a wonderful form of pastoral care.
Thank you, Carol.
Amen.
Amen.
What do you see in today's time? What's the greatest need or maybe even trend in pastoral care right now that maybe we need to focus on or we've overlooked or we need to pay more attention to?
Let me respond to your initial question, the greatest need. I think the greatest need is for us to recognize that we are still wrestling with the pandemic and that it's still having an impact on our mental, physical health. We have been so interested in and longing for the return to normal. Now that some of those requirements that were put in place earlier have been lifted, we're moving as though, everything's back to normal, which means I don't have to be attentive to the kinds of trauma and drama that happened when we were sheltering in place. Everything has been normalized, but it hasn't. A lot of the troubles that were revealed during the shelter in place, they haven't gone away. And so we still need to be caring for one another. The shelter in place, the moving worship online, the kinds of social distancing that were established, it caused us to raise questions about what it means to be human. We had these definitions of what it meant to be human, which were often grounded in relationship and touch. We went through this moment of, we can't touch one another, so am I still human? We still have to sort that out. How are you understanding what it means to be human and what it means to be a worshiping community? Part of what was just shared is we learned some things about community of faith that said we can still be a community of faith even though we're not in the sanctuary altogether. There are some folks that have been longing to end this kind of Zoom spirituality. But we can't go back. What do we do with that? How do we ensure that our online learners, that our online worshipers still feel a part of the community of faith? The churches that will have, 2 services a Sunday, the early service and the traditional worship hour, those churches often have 2 separate congregations. It's a different worship style in the morning than in the traditional, and those folks never come together. You end up forming two different congregations within one church building. What do you think is happening with online worshipers and sanctuary worshipers? And what are we going to do to ensure that they always feel like they're a part of one church instead of having a separate church here and we who were gathered? So I think our pastoral care is one of those ways that we all feel together. I mentioned earlier the suicides on college campuses. Well, the country is absolutely going crazy right now with mass shootings. You can't tell me that's unrelated to pandemic life. So what are we going to do to address the social trauma that folks are experiencing? We have to attend to it.
If you take down the text on the screen, then our pictures would be bigger.
Sure. Hit escape right here. And then stop share. Get that. There we go. All right, Jack. Good request.
Thank you.
How to make you feel connected? There we go.
It's good to see you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So pastoral care, is it just for pastors? That's a softball.
Absolutely not. Which is why I said that the pastoral is not about being the pastor, it's about your understanding and the approach that you take to offering care to another. So everyone in this room can engage in ministries of pastoral care, can do pastoral care visits. Pastoral caring prayers.
Do you think that social media is, particularly for young people, is contributing to a sense of alienation? I was reading about one teacher who just decided at the end of the class period she was going to have them choose a partner and have conversation, and a lot of them had difficulty with that. So I was just wondering on your take on that.
And I'll add to that, one of my grandsons is at TU, and they don't talk to each other. It's just sad.
Your grandson
Is at TU, yeah, me, speak soft. At TU, you know, the classmates don't talk and communicate like they used to.
Really?
Yeah, and COVID took its toll on TU. And suicides too.
Yes, social media has affected how we understand what it means to be alive. It's affected how we understand family relationships. You know, you have those folks who will wake up every morning, go to Facebook. Good morning, Facebook family. And as you've just stated, it's more difficult for us to sit down and talk to one another because we find it so much easier to do this. And so we're losing certain skills. Folks were talking earlier, folks, the world, theorists, were saying that the next evolutionary change in humanity will be the thumbs are going to grow in a certain way because of foot.
Maybe an extra thumb.
Oh, please. So, yeah, how are we going to address this? How are we going to engage this as ways of intervention? You know, I just mentioned, you know, the next evolution. Well, when I began my studies of pastoral care and counseling and preparing myself for the ministry of pastoral counseling, it was all about being in the same room with someone. But then there was this notion of, well, we're going to have to do phone counseling. And so I started doing some phone counseling, and even had someone across the sea that would call me up saying, I need a session, and I do counseling on the phone. Well, now we're doing video counseling. We're going to have to do the same thing in terms of pastoral care. Developing the skills that learn how to reach a person who is not sitting in front of you, which in some instances means you have to really improve, increase, sharpen your listening skills. I mean, there are certain cues you catch when you're sitting in front of someone, because you can take in the whole body, read body language. Well, when they're on the screen, you're catching this much. And you can't see that their foot is because of nervousness or great discomfort. You can't see those things that become cues and indicators, so you have to learn how to read facial expressions more carefully and listen more carefully to what is being said in between not just the sentences but the words. All these things call us to be more attentive to what it means to be human and alive. Other questions?
The way you characterize the relationship between Legion and the community was particularly interesting. When I heard it, I actually had a different, but when you described it, it prompted me to think, sometimes the most well-intentioned families and caregivers get it wrong in terms of how to interact with someone who's deeply troubled. And you know, there are cares out there today that just do nothing and make things worse. And there can be some deep trauma, hurt, guilt, all sorts of things about we wanted to help and we made it worse. And I see that dynamic now in that story more than I have before. I wonder if you could comment on that aspect of it.
Absolutely.
And when you see something that works, it's joy, but it's a complicated, maybe it's fear, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's so many things. You know, what did we do? We did our best. As sort of the, anyway.
Yeah. It's what you just identified, which we might see at the extremes, but it's also what are the coping mechanisms that person in the family takes on. Substance abuse can be one of those things that gets taken on, and so they are going crazy because of the substances that they are engaging in, and that then creates its own set of issues that further sends the person out. And then the family gets to the point of saying, I'm done, you have to go. I don't care if the prison system comes and gets you, you're out of here.
Yeah.
And so that's what we have in this text. It is really the pain that accompanies relationships that don't go well. And how do we restore our sense of relationship and family? And it hurts.
My veterinarian,
Speak up.
okay, I'll speak up. My veterinarian, is Christine Kunzweiler. And she's very open about the mental health challenges of their middle child. You know him? And on Easter, their child now is in Bonita. She definitely has mental health issues. She has forever. And I wouldn't be sharing this if she hadn't. She wants it shared. And Steve has gotten very active in the mental health field now too. But she had dreams. She thought she was protecting her father because somebody was coming after him, and she was saving him when she stabbed herself first, but then she stabbed him. And she's now in Bonita. And on Easter, this is getting more to where you are, only 3 people showed up for their families that are in there. Just 3.
At Benita.
At Bonita.
The whole app is
But they
just-
don't have pastoral care coming in to help these people. And my guess is that most of them, the families have said, hey, you are our problem, you're no longer our problem, we don't wanna deal with you. Whereas their family, we would all be grateful to have. But it just fits right in with, I mean, I've never heard this scripture identify any of this in this respect, and I appreciate it very much. I got a lot to contemplate here.
Great.
And I will add,
A word that's popping in my mind right now is, where is forgiveness in this? And I think Jesus' command to the man to return home gives a path challenging him into the grace of forgiveness. And also to invite the town to come on that path as well, to forgive him for his breaking the shackles or whatever. I mean, that pathway has to be tough, but I think it's the pathway.
Absolutely.
But related to that, sometimes it's really not a good thing to go back to the place where all the pain was caused. And say you were being abused and, or drugs were accessible to you, or those same friendship group. So you have to sort of weigh those things in the balance, I guess.
Yes. While it may not be to your benefit and advantage to stay, I think it still is important to go back and to do what you can to make amends or to let folks know
10:28.
that the party's over. You know, I'm not going to be your scapegoat, whatever any longer. And that's where that process of forgiveness does come in, where sometimes a person has to be able to confront so they can forgive themselves.
This has been wonderful,
I think you
enlightening,
have,
challenging.
yeah, something you wanted to finish up with too, and I don't wanna miss that. We've just got such short time.
And so I'll just go down a list of what the final two slides presented, that we have to be aware and cautious in those moments when and where mental health is declared a faith issue within the church. That you have this issue because you have little faith. We need to be aware and attend to mental health and gun violence. I've already named that, but it's important that we recognize that men, women, and children are being killed in the streets through random gun violence and aggressive assaults. And so there was a recent assault of someone taking an assault rifle and killing neighbors, women, and the youngest was 8 years old. Folks who are killing their families and then committing suicide. Domestic violence escalated when we were in the shelter in place, and domestic violence truly is a silent killer within the church because we think it's always something that happens someplace else without recognizing to someone else, without recognizing that sometimes domestic violence escalates after worship service. Think of some of the churches and some of the lessons get taught about family, structure, head, silence. And so they leave church, and if that's not happening the way that message went,
Guilt.
and so finally, some thematic areas of ministry that we need to be attentive to: crises, family, education, community revitalization, and social justice, all that are related to pastoral care, that we tend not to put into the pastoral care boat. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone.
Good to
Bye.
see you.
Good to see you
Good to see you
all.
all.
Yes, bye-bye.
Take care,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
Jack, take care.
Take
Hey,
care.
Brooks.
Hey, Brooks.
Hey, Bobby.
Hey, Brooks, there you go.